Do camera lenses that are designed for APS-C cameras like the Sony FX30 provide more light to those sensors than a full-frame lens does to the same sensor when both lenses are set to the same f-stop number, like f2.8, for example, which both of these lenses are? That's something I was a bit confused about for a while between APS-C specific lenses and full-frame lenses, because there are some assumptions out there that APS-C lenses do focus more light on the sensor, and I wanted to test that, mainly to see if using APS-C lenses would allow me to use a lower ISO setting and potentially give me a cleaner image overall. And I know there's more to it than that. I know it's not that simple. The f-stop number on a lens is just a relationship between how large the aperture is in comparison to its focal length, more or less. And with lenses designed to fit different sensor sizes, that f-stop number isn't relatable as a one-to-one relationship. But f-stop is a good way for those of us just shopping for lenses to understand potential depth of field and light gathering benefits of our lenses. So at the very least, it's a good place to start. But if they don't provide more light, then why would you bother getting APS-C specific lenses when, depending on the camera system and lens mount, you can just use your full frame lenses, like I can use both of these lenses on my Sony FX30 or even on my Sony a7 IV. And that's assuming that, like me, you have way more lenses for your full frame cameras like I do for my Sony cameras than I have APS-C specific lenses for my FX30. I'll come back to some of the main benefits of APS-C lenses at the end, and some of those benefits and reasons may be more important for you in your situation. And I'm not going to get super technical because I don't know all about lens optics. I'm not an engineer in that field, but long story short, no, APS-C lenses don't give you more light at the same f-stop number. So you typically won't get that benefit of lowering your ISO and therefore having a potentially cleaner image just by using an APS-C lens. And I'll show you many examples in this video. And I'm going to start by using this Tamron 17-70 lens, which is made for APS-C, and compare it against a couple of other lenses to see if this lens lets in more light than a similar lens made for full frame. Because again, on any APS-C camera, at least in the Sony world, as long as the lens mount is the same, you can use full frame lenses on your Sony FX30 or other Sony APS-C camera. You'll just get a tighter field of view using a full frame lens on an APS-C camera. And conversely, if you put an APS-C lens on a full frame camera, hang on, we'll put this APS-C lens on my Sony a7 IV, and I will show you what that looks like. There we go. Obviously, as you can see, as most of you are used to, we get that vignette around the frame when we put an APS-C lens on a full frame camera. This kind of looks like something out of a Wes Anderson movie, but you get the idea. But my question is, will this lens provide more light to that sensor? So let's get into that. Now, this is the Viltrox 13mm f1.4 lens on my Sony FX30. It looks great in this view, but I don't have any more f1.4 lenses for APS-C to test against. All my other lenses are f2.8. But what we can do is we can stop that lens down to f2.8 and then test it against this Tamron 17-70 APS-C lens, also at f2.8, because that's as wide of an aperture as this lens has. But then we can test both of those against this Sigma 16-28 full frame lens. It's an f2.8 lens meant for full frame Sony, and see if either that lens or this lens provide more light to that sensor with the same ISO settings and the same light in the room as opposed to these two full frame lenses. So let's just stop that lens down to f2.8. Then again, without changing the lighting in the room, let's just bring up the ISO back to where my face is at a decent exposure. There we go. ISO 1250 is basically the same exposure to the sensor as that camera was at ISO 400 when the lens was at f1.4. So we'll use this as the first example. Again, Viltrox 13mm at f2.8, ISO 1250, and I'll just be still for a second. All right, so I'm going to swap out that lens now, and the first one I want to test it against is this Sigma 16-28 full frame lens, because when I do change lenses, this will give a more narrow field of view. This is the widest full frame lens that I have, so at least the field of view won't change much, and we'll see if the lighting changes without making any changes to the ISO or the aperture or the lighting in the room, see if the sensor gets any more light out of this f2.8 lens versus that lens at f2.8. All right, so that is the Sigma 16-28 full frame lens for Sony E-mount. Obviously, you get a different field of view versus this 13mm for APS-C, but at the same f-stop number of f2.8, and looking at my monitors down here to judge exposure, without changing the ISO on the camera, without changing the lighting in the room, it doesn't appear that that lens at f2.8 provides any less light than this APS-C lens at f2.8. But we'll put these images side by side or top and bottom in the video edit here, and we'll just look at them with waveforms and other exposure tools and just your eyeballs. Did it look more dim or brighter from one lens to the other? All right, so basically with these two lenses, no, there's no difference. Now I'm gonna swap out to this Tamron 17-28. This is also a full frame lens because when I put this lens on that camera and then I put the Tamron 17-70 APS-C lens, the fields of view should be identical. So real quick, let me switch to the Tamron 17-28 full frame lens. Hang on. All right, so Tamron 17-28 full frame lens on the FX30, because when I swap, again, we'll get the same field of view out of that lens versus this APS-C lens. So if we look at my camera settings, I haven't changed anything. I'm at 1/52.7th of a second shutter speed so that that light doesn't get any flicker back there. I'm at f2.8, obviously, ISO 1250. Haven't made any lighting changes to the room, so we'll sit here for a sec. And now we'll swap directly over to the Tamron 17-70 for APS-C. All right, so now we're on the Tamron 17-70 APS-C lens. Field of view hasn't changed, and nor have I had to change any settings on the camera. I'm still getting the exact same exposure according to my false color and my waveforms that I was getting on this full frame lens with both lenses at f2.8. And here's a comparison between the Tamron 17-70 versus the Tamron 17-28 as I switch back and forth between each lens. And here are both lenses side by side, the Tamron 17-70 on the left and the Tamron 17-28 on the right, again, both with the same settings on the camera. And I'm going to do a voiceover on this portion where I've got movement on both cameras. Again, the Tamron 17-70 on the left, Tamron 17-28 on the right. And even when I zoom in here in post, you can see there's not a lot of difference. There's probably a minor color difference between the lenses, but that's typical of most lenses, even from the same manufacturer. And because with f2.8 lenses on the Sony FX30 and my ISO having to be at 1250, I find the FX30's ISO performance is not as good as a full frame camera, and that's what I want to look at here in this shot. Do we see any difference from the full frame lens versus the APS-C lens? And really we shouldn't, because we're at the same ISO level on the camera, so really the lens itself shouldn't have a difference on noise, but hey, let's zoom in and punch in and take a look anyway. But if we look in the dark areas, maybe here on my shirt or there in the background, is there a difference? But really, to my eye, there's really no difference in color, exposure, or noise between the APS-C specific lens or my full frame lens. And here's a quick comparison between the Viltrox 13mm, also at f2.8 of ISO 1250, as compared against those other two lenses. All right, so we're back on the Viltrox 13mm for now. So what's the point? What's the conclusion here? If we're not getting any light benefits out of APS-C specific lenses over our full frame lenses, then what's the point of these lenses? Well, it really comes down to size and weight. Part of the benefit of having a smaller sensor camera system like an FX30 or even the Micro Four Thirds system, of which I have a Panasonic GH5, is the fact that the lenses that give you the same fields of view are so much smaller than their full frame equivalents, because those full frame equivalents have to have lens elements that can focus light on a larger sensor. When you have a smaller sensor, You don't have to focus the light on such a large area. You can focus it down. Therefore, the lens elements can be smaller and the aperture can still be a relative f2.8 on this lens versus this lens. So you might ask, okay, what is the actual size benefit? Well, if you take this Tamron 17-70 for APS-C, it's basically the same field of view equivalent as a 24-105 on a full frame camera system like my Sony a7 IV here. And I know it's not quite as wide as 24-105, it's closer to about 25.5 millimeters on the wide end, and that's kind of Tamron's thing. Sometimes they will take a millimeter off of the wide end, being 17 versus maybe something like 16 millimeters. They did that on this 17-70, and they did it on the 17-28. A lot of times these will be 16-28 or 16-35, but it's close enough that you can consider it basically a 24-105. Now, the Sony 24-105, I had that lens for a bit. It's a bit large, it's not overly large, but it's also an f4 lens. This Tamron 17-70 is f2.8. If you were to have a 24-105 f2.8 for full frame, the lens would be a lot larger and a lot heavier because that's just how physics works of glass and having to focus that light on a larger sensor. But that extra reach and extra light gathering of a larger aperture like f2.8 may be important to you. And here's a shot of the FX30 in my living room as I zoom all the way in, showing that extended zoom range. As compared to the Tamron 28-75 on my Sony a7 IV, you often just get less reach out of full frame lenses if you want to stick to wide fixed apertures like 2.8. And here's a quick comparison in the same space using the Tamron 17-70 APS-C lens on the Sony FX30 versus the Tamron 28-75 full frame lens on the FX30. And as I swap back and forth, watch the waveforms here, because even though it is light outside and the sun could be coming or going behind a cloud, I swap lenses as fast as possible, but there does seem to be a little bit of a jump up in exposure when I swap to the full frame Tamron 28-75 lens, signifying that that full frame lens does provide a little bit more light overall to the sensor on the Sony FX30. So here's the Tamron 17-70, and there is the Tamron 28-75 waveforms. And if we watch those again, here's the Tamron 17-70 APS-C lens. Now watch right here on the waveforms as I switch to the 28-75 full frame lens. And right there, you can see a bit of a bump in exposure, again, keeping all of the camera settings the same. So we may get a little bit more light overall with the full frame 28-75 on something like the Sony FX30. It's minor. It may not be something you have to make major changes to your camera settings with, but it's something that I noticed, so I wanted to point it out. So I then set up everything in a much more controlled lighting situation with my X-Rite color checker here, filming with both lenses on my Sony FX30. And we can look at the waveforms here in that fixed lighting situation, and you can see they're basically the same. So just watch out for those minor changes between full frame lenses versus APS-C lenses. And as far as I know, there's only one f2.8 lens that's 24-105 for full frame, and that's this model from Canon, which goes for about $3,000, and it is massive as compared to this Tamron 17-70. And let's see here, if we look at the specs of the Canon lens, the $3,000 Canon lens, it is 46.9 ounces or 2.9 pounds, and it says right here it is 7.8 inches long, which is about like that, whereas this Tamron 17-70 is only about 5 inches long. And let's look at the weight of the Tamron. It is 525 grams, which is just a little over 1 pound there for this Tamron 17-70 f2.8. And here's a quick side-by-side size comparison between the Sony lens, not the Canon lens, between the Sony lens and the Tamron 17-70 APS-C lens. And I sized these images to be accurate against each other. And you can see that the Tamron 17-70 is just a bit longer than the Sony 24-105 f4, but the Tamron is thinner overall, has a smaller filter thread size, and comes in lighter than the Sony lens as well. And for comparison, that Canon lens is again the only f2.8 24-105 that I know of. It's massive, it's expensive, but that's the only way you're gonna get f2.8. Every other 24-105 that I know of is f4. So with APS-C lenses, you can get a larger focal range, a larger zoom range, and a smaller lens with a comparably wider aperture than a full frame lens, and you don't have to spend as much money. So that's the benefit. Size, weight, and cost, not so much light gathering. So I hope this was helpful. It was very helpful for me. I learned a lot looking up some of these specs of these other lenses and doing these tests. Hopefully some of this information was helpful. I do appreciate you watching. Hit those like and subscribe buttons, and we'll see you later.